couple of weeks back, I was sitting at a cafe in Mount Shasta, California. Vanessa was taking a class in how to construct a Native American hand drum with a friend of ours, who some of you may have met in this channel because we stopped by some petroglyphs on our way back from Tucson, Arizona with Heather. Anyway, Heather had a class, and because I was not participating in the drum making class, I had plenty of drums to beat on, as followers of Golden Phoenix Publish are well aware. I just hung out at coffee shops. Well, while at the coffee shop, I met lots of really interesting people. One was an ex-baseball player from the AAA leagues in the United States and also played in Mexico. Another was a physiologist who taught at a local community college there. There was a beautiful, wonderful family from Japan I met there. We had all kinds of talks. And one of the things that came out of it all, ooh, this is not the right camera to do this with. It's not very bright, but I'm going to do it anyway. What the heck? This is a camera I use for my astrovids, and I'm not going to change the settings. Anyway, you can read it. Anyway, so I met a family that lives in the United States, but originally came out of Japan. We had some wonderful conversations. Meanwhile, I finally had settled down to develop this next series on the spatio-temporal moments, a concept, and I had this sheet laid out before me. And this sheet, if you can see it, consists of a lot of dots. Well, just consider these dots. They form a matrix. Now consider them not just from two dimensions, length and width, but consider them in 3 dimensions. So they just keep going on and on and on. They all have the same basic pattern over and over again. And the reason that pattern holds up is because each of these nuclei are somehow a point or a center that is able to both radiate pressure outward and draw things inward according to the mathematics that I expressed in the last presentation on the spatio-temporal moments series. And as you recall from that whole series that I've been exploring, it's all been developing. I haven't thought about this from the beginning. I am thinking it through in real time. And I was sitting at a table, and a young lady came up with her friend, Jessie, and her friend was Katharina, or Caroline, or Christina, yes, Christina. Anyway, I'm not very good with facts, because facts take up a lot of oxygen in your brain, and I prefer to stay with abstractions as much as possible. Wonderful ladies. Immediately, Jessie sat down right next to me and was looking at this drawing here and wanted to engage me in conversation. So I had an opportunity to explain spatio-temporal moments and the origins of all energy and matter in the universe as something that transcends, something that existed before the Big Bang, and some transcendental cause actually worked this fabric of reality into something that both transmits energy and particularizes into matter. So that's a transcendental. But anyway, so we had a lot of conversations about things both transcendental and material. What I come to find out is these two young ladies have a podcast on channel. I'll go ahead and add that information later. Anyway, they have a podcast called Glitch the Matrix. And of course, if you look at this, it is clearly a matrix of points in space. Not doing anything right now, just sitting there. So there's no change, meaning there's no time. So I had this laid out, and I was beginning to develop my theme, and my theme is, how is it possible for such a matrix to turn into something matter, which matter has several properties. One of the principles is the Pauli exclusion principle, which means no two material things can function or coincide in space and in time in the same location. That's the Pauli exclusion principle. Anyway, that's one aspect of matter. The others are things like mass and inertia. They can have charge. They can distribute their mass according to whether or not it's the nucleus of an atom or the electrons or whether it's in a molecule. All kinds of things fall out of that. But let's just say this was sitting on the table before we began our discussion with the young ladies, and they brought up the idea of a matrix. So I said, why not just call this a matrix? Spatio-Atemporal matrix. Why is it atemporal? Because nothing's happening. If there ain't no happening, there ain't no change. If there ain't no change, there's no time. Well, alrighty then. The next thing we're going to just briefly recover before I go into my notes from doing some investigation online into how things can particulate, become particles if they're pure energy. This, of course, is what I call an efflorescence of a spatio-temporal field. It shows you, one, that there's a nucleate particle, the nuclear or point in space, which could be dimensionless, dimensioned, I don't know, and its field of influence. And that field of influence is a point where at the most extreme point it begins to interact with another field of influence right here. So you have these two spheres of influence. They're just touching, they are tangential. You can also have a point based on all of these matrical points being the same distance apart, which I call 1/2. It's just a value that can be plugged into an equation to explain it. So every one of these is, we're going to assume that every one of these spheres of influence is a unitary 1, and every nucleus is halfway through at half, and then there's an equation that relates to two factors, an expansionary, contractionary influence that creates a sphere of influence, which maintains the matrix, etc., etc. And those equations are 1 over, I believe it's 1 over 2 squared, no, 1 over 1/2 squared. Yeah, and the other is, don't get me into the mathematics right now. I'll review that maybe at some point in this. But anyway, so you have these spheres of influence with a core, nuclei, a sphere of influence going out, and this one, of course, was tangential touching. This one is a little bit of an inclusion in the next sphere, and that all has to do with the distance between all of these points. And then finally, there's a potential for spheres that actually have a sphere of influence that goes so deeply into their neighbors that the outermost sphere of influence where the forces are balanced is just right at the nucleus of another sphere, which brings us back to this. Just have a look again. Imagine circles around all of these, some interacting tangentially, some are somewhat invasive, and some actually penetrate one to the next to touch. The sphere of influence touches the nuclei of another sphere. All right. Now, of course, all that is based on this efflorescence. Some call it the flower of life, whatever you wish. I don't care. I call it an efflorescence of 33 of these spheres of influence in 3 dimensions. From the side it might look like this, and from the top it'll look like this, which has all been covered in previous Golden Phoenix published video, which, by the way, I have now set up a playlist that is called Cosmology to cover all this in sequence so you can follow it better. All right, so what about now? Well, the thing I've been thinking about has really vexed me is how do you take something like this efflorescence or all of these interactions in the matrix and turn them into something that exhibits the Pauli exclusion principle and can account for all the forces of nature, which are the strong force binding nuclei together, the weak force, which is on the outside, which I personally think is there to prevent electrons from falling in. Then you have the electrons, which participate in the electromagnetic force, and then you have the gravitational force. So those are the 4 known forces of nature. All right, so how do these things particularize? How do they become particles? Okay, so we've already covered how you can think of a field of spatio-atemporal moments as a matrix. Now remember, nothing's happening in that matrix. There's no flux, no change, it's just sitting there. Such a matrix consists of 3-dimensional order of points surrounded by a sphere of influence. I've covered that. Each sphere of influence is maintained by a combination of 2 forces, one expansive, which I call the radiational force, and the other contractive, which I call the gravitational force. And when they're in perfect balance, That's what, between all of the points in the matrix, that's what creates its stability. However, should the matrix become disturbed in any way, the geometry of the matrix goes into flux. Cool word, flux. I like that word, flux. And that's what happens in the matrix whenever something comes in and disturbs it. And the thing that typically disturbs it is light, some kind of energy, which we interpret as a photon, which a photon is both a particle and a wave at the same time, which is very confusing to people, but makes a lot more sense when you understand spatio-atemporal moments. Normally, such a flux of spatio-atemporal moments dissipates by what I called colloidal transmission. I just came up with this word and looked it up. A colloid is a suspension of particles in some kind of a substance that spread out and basically take on the form of a matrix, if not too disturbed. So I'm going to call it, when a flux of disturbance occurs in a spatio-atemporal moment, it dissipates by colloidal transmission. Try to hold me to this, folks. I'm not really good at maintaining the terminology over time. As I said before, I'm more interested in the abstract and the concrete. It takes up oxygen in your brain to remember a lot of disparate facts, but I'll try to hold to this basic phraseology. A flux in atemporal moments results is dissipated by colloidal transmission. Oh, very cool. I love words. All right, now, during colloidal transmission, all such spatio-atemporal moments within the matrix, which is basically spread everywhere in the cosmos, that matrix preceded the Big Bang, will post-seed any extraction of energy when the energy all dissipates. Matter will probably all fall apart, and it'll all just become this huge matrix of spatio-atemporal moments again. But during colloidal transmission, the matrix becomes informed by what we would call spatio-temporal moments. So now change and transmission, colloidal transmission is occurring. Spatio-temporal moments undergo change. I've already emphasized this. Any change that happens in the matrix of atemporal moments is time. So time is only something that exists because things change. And if things never change, there would be no such thing as time. So forget all this ridiculous separation of time and space and time. They're a unity. Anything that occurs in space that is different from what used to happen is change. And any change that occurs is time. And if you follow your basic understanding of all physics, the only thing that can bring about change in anything is energy. And so energy is related to time. I don't want to get too deep into that right now. Maybe if it has more significance later. However, abnormally, a flux of spatio-atemporal moments, which I call SAMs, or Samanthas if you will, can become so excessive that spontaneous symmetry breaking occurs within the matrix. Now, where did I come up with that? Dude, I just went and I looked at all kinds of stuff associated with the standard model of physics. And the standard model basically comes down to the fact that you get these things called quarks. And I don't want to get too deeply into them, but all the nuclear particles are formed of 2 quarks, or 3 quarks, and I'll explore that in more detail later. I don't want to get into it, but when I started looking into quarks, and I started looking into the Higgs field, and then I went on, I discovered a principle called spontaneous symmetry breaking. So, if you go back to our matrix, and stuff starts to happen, this is the efflorescence, but stuff starts to happen, there's the potential for spontaneous symmetry breaking as energy moves through the system. As an aside, there's also aspontaneous symmetry breaking that occurs, but that only occurs when something is measured. And boy, when I saw that you measure something and it can cause aspontaneous symmetry breaking, what did that mean to me? It just means entanglement, perceptual entanglement. The whole problem of physics has to do with quantum theory, which came out of the idea that when you start to measure something, you fix it. And when you fix something in space and time, you give it a form, it has a location. All of those things are an example of measuring and causing a certain kind of particularization. So I don't want to get in too deep. If we have more questions later on, ask me in the notes. Maybe I'll develop this further later on. Okay, however, during spontaneous symmetry breaking, particularization can occur either briefly or under certain conditions permanently. And I'm only using permanently in quotes because ultimately I think all of this begins to dissipate again once there's no more stimulation occurring in the cosmos due to the propagation of energy, which we measure as photons. Okay, as a result of all of this, matter may then come into existence. Now, we will explore the Standard Model in a future presentation on spatio-atemporal moments. And at that time, I'll introduce the idea of quarks and color chromodynamics and all this other stuff, none of which I ever studied in particular, but you can go online, you can read about it, and the language is extremely dense. But if you use your imagination and kind of like get in touch with the matrix of spatio-atemporal moments and see what they're talking about, it all starts to make sense. All right, so basically, what have we covered here? We have covered the particularization of spatio-temporal moments. We've talked about how they start off as atemporal moments, that energy causes them to become temporal moments because some kind of flux occurs in the colloidal transmission of the energy, which can, if surplus amount of energy, and they know how much energy this is, and it's like in the mega electron volt, I think it's 130 mega electron volts. Then what starts to happen is you start to particularize, the forces of nature begin to express themselves, all kinds of stuff that I may cover in a future, I probably will cover in a future exploration of spatio-atemporal and temporal moments. Anyway, we're talking about how something that basically exists in stasis gets disturbed. And if the disturbance is strong enough, it will cause asymmetrical symmetry breaking, which can be called spontaneous symmetry breaking, and that can result in the creation of particles. And one of the key concepts of all that, which I haven't expressed, is that if you put all the particles back together again, they once again become symmetrical as opposed to asymmetrical, because it's the asymmetries that bring about the manifestation of particles. So, hey, there we have it. The particularization of spatio-temporal moments out of atemporal moments, and how something that pre-existed the Big Bang can particularize into the subatomic particles, atomics, and later on molecules, and all kinds of other things that are associated with the basic principle of stressor theory. And I hope this hasn't stressed your brain too much, and I hope the camera not being particularly bright has not induced some issues. I'll put some nice soothing background music in. The kinds of things I think SAMs and STMs would enjoy. Anyway, signing off, this is the 7th in the series on spatio-temporal moments and stressor theory, and we will build more on this in the future. Carpe diem.